Vice President Joe Biden, Vice President, Vice President Joe Biden.
Mr. President, Mr. President, Mr. President, Mr. President, the Vice President, Mr. President, Biden, Mr. President, Joe, Vice President Biden, Mr. President, now Mr. President, your advice.
Mr. President, Joe Biden, Vice President. Joe, Vice President Biden, Joe Biden. Joe, Vice President, Joe Biden, the Vice President. President.
Joe Biden, United States, Joe Biden, the United States, Joe Biden, Joe Biden, Vice President, Vice President Biden, Joe Biden, the President, Vice President, Joe Biden, Vice President Biden, Joe.
Mr. President, Vice President Biden, Joe Biden, Mr. President, Vice President.
Mr. President, Vice President Joe Biden, the United States, Mr. President, Joe Biden, Mr. President Biden, Mr. President, Joe President, Joe Vice President, Joe President, the President, Joe Vice President Biden, Joe, Mr. President, Vice President, Joe Vice President Joe Biden, Vice President Joe Biden,
President of the United States, Mr. President, Joe Biden, President, and Mr. President of the United States, Vice President, Mr. President.
The United States, Mr. President, Joe Vice, United States, President,
Mr. President, Mr. Vice President, the United States, the President, Vice President, President, Joe Biden, Biden's President, Vice President, Biden, President, Vice President, Joe Biden, the Vice President of the State, the Vice President, the President, Vice President,
President of the United States, Joe Biden, Mr. President, Joe Biden, Vice President, Joe Biden, the Vice President, Vice President, Joe Biden, Vice President, Joe Biden, the Vice President of the United States,
President, Mr. President, Vice President Joe Biden, Vice President, Joe, Mr. President, Joe, Vice President, Joe, United States, Mr. President, Joe Biden, Mr. President, Joe Biden, Joe, Mr. Vice President, Joe, President,
Mr. President, Joe Biden, the United States, Vice President, the United States, Joe Biden, Vice President, Joe Biden, the Vice President, the Vice President of the United States, Joe Biden, Joe Biden, for Vice President, Joe Biden, Vice President, the Vice President, Mr. President,
Vice President, Mr. President, Mr. Vice President, Joe Biden, Joe.
President, the President, the Vice President, the President, Mr. President, the President, Joe Biden, Joe, Vice President, the President, Vice President of the United States.
Mr. President, the Vice President, Joe, the United States.
Mr. President of the United States, the Vice President Joe Biden, the Vice President, Joe Biden, the Vice President, Joe Biden, the United States Vice President, Joe Biden, the United States Vice President, Joe Biden, the Vice President, Joe Biden, the Vice President, United States.
Mr. President, Joe Biden, the Vice President, the Biden, Joe's Vice President, Mr. Vice President, the President, Vice President of the United States, Joe Biden, Vice President of the United States. Mr. President,
Joe Biden, the Vice President, Joe Biden, Vice President, Biden, Vice President, Biden, Vice President States, and President, Biden, Joe Biden, Vice President, Joe Biden.
Mr. President, Joe Biden, Mr. Vice President.
Mr. President,
Joe Biden,
President, Vice President, Biden, Vice President Biden, the Vice President, Joe.
Mr. President, Vice President Biden, Vice President Joe Biden, Mr. Vice President, or Mr. Vice President.
Joe Biden, Joe Biden, Vice President Joe Biden, Joe Biden, Vice President, Mr. President,
Mr. President, the Vice President,